Hello everyone, Storm here, and today I'm going to be discussing what might have happened if Nick survived. No, not that one. Not that one either. That's the one. Nick from Telltale's The Walking Dead. This was a character honestly not loved by many, but it was possible to keep him alive in Season 2. However, his role was unimportant after saving him, and he ended up dying off screen later. But what if he didn't do that? Let's find out now. To start, we'll have to begin during the escape from House, and we will remove Nick being shot. Instead, the bullet barely misses, allowing him to continue after Luke and Sarah without much issue. After finding Sarah, Luke and Nick get holed up in a trailer with her. They're surrounded by walkers, but Sarah doesn't want to leave, and Luke isn't going to leave her, so Nick bravely goes out to look for help, running through the walkers. But this time, he doesn't have that bullet wound holding him back, so he's able to keep himself alive. This is what we're told happened by Luke, except that Nick died in canon and he had the bullet, and it's a really good follow-up to Nick's arc. He's been screwing things up for everyone, getting them hurt, putting them in danger, but when the moment finally came, he stepped up and put his life on the line for Luke and Sarah. The reason his death feels so weak is because he didn't do much on screen. All of that was off screen. And here it still would be, but it needs to be known to you guys how significant this moment is for Nick's character, since the what if kinda hinges on him continuing to live past this point, so I need to get his characterization out of the way. Anyway, after searching for help, Nick finds Jane and Clementine, with Nick explaining what happened and where Sarah and Luke are. He helps them get through the few walkers there are leading up to Luke and Sarah's location before assisting Clem in creating the distraction for the others. After that, Nick rushes to bust down the door in order to reach his friends, which gets them a bit quicker, as I imagine Nick has the force Clem was lacking. Inside, Luke is happy Nick found help and made it back, but the issue of Sarah not wanting to leave is still very present. Luckily, I think Nick's presence solves that issue and more. You see, Luke couldn't boost Clem up to the skylight due to his injured ribs. This forced them to use the only barrier keeping the walkers out as a step stool to help them escape. However, Nick is now here and could likely help boost everyone up, which buys them even more time to convince Sarah to leave, as they don't have to sacrifice their defense. And remember how I said Nick might solve the Sarah problem? Well, Nick has experienced the loss of his mother, which he didn't take well, not to mention his Uncle Pete and also Matthew, both of whom he sees as his own fault. So he has the experience through which he can relate to Sarah, and given that he's known her way longer than Clementine, he might actually be able to get through to her. Luke has always been better at moving on and not dwelling on their losses, which is a thing Nick mentions being envious of in canon. But Nick has that capability of dwelling, as he's constantly living through it, so he can entirely understand the helplessness Sarah is feeling. What he has might be what Luke lacks in the same way that Luke has what he lacks. However, with Nick's personality and habit of messing things up, it's a little unlikely he solves every problem this easily, so I decided to make it a bit more difficult. Nick's motivation to step up would be very much based on the support he's been receiving. And as Clementine, so far there are multiple times when you could help Nick, so I chose a few that seem significant to me. Accepting Nick's apology for shooting at you in episode 1, giving Nick his watch in episode 2, and either going with Pete in episode 1 or going with Nick and motivating him to leave with you in episode 2. The reason why I have going with Pete as an option that helps Nick is because he gets upset if you don't go with Pete in canon, as Pete dies right there. Additionally, if you do go with him, Nick will ask about Pete's final moments and Clem can give him that closure. So as long as you accept the apology, give Nick the watch, and don't leave Nick behind in episode 2 if you went with him, Nick will have the right headspace to help Sarah save herself. Maybe he even offers her the watch Pete gave him, which would be really sweet. Now if you don't do these things, it still comes down to Clem to just slap Sarah. So Nick being here just greatly improves the chances of Sarah surviving if you treated him right. Anyway, Clem, Luke, Nick, and Jane leave with or without Sarah. If you were forced to leave her behind, Nick would feel horrible, as he just couldn't get through to her. If Clementine made a solid attempt, he'd thank her for trying, and mainly just be upset at himself, as they've gotten so used to Clem saving their butts, they forgot that she's just a kid. She shouldn't be the one they rely on to motivate a girl to keep going. If Clementine gave up easily or just stayed silent, Nick would mainly be harsh to Jane, as again, he can't fully blame Clem, he can only blame her influences. Now if Nick failed, but Clem slapped Sarah, then he'd be disappointed in his own attempts, but thankful that they have Clementine. And lastly, if Nick succeeded in getting Sarah out, then he'd thank Clem for helping him, as he only got that kind of fortitude because of her believing in him. As they arrive back at camp, Nick would stay with Rebecca, with Sarah being there as well, assuming that she survived. Clem then goes off to do the side quests with Mike and Bonnie and Jane. The only difference is that Nick would agree to cover for Luke in securing the area when he goes to have his alone time with Jane. Sadly, Nick ends up focusing more on Rebecca and Sarah, so he fails to watch out effectively, but arguably for good reason. But nevertheless, this leads to walkers showing up and chasing the group back to the observation deck. After making it up, Clementine and the others begin fighting off the walkers and drop the deck to prevent them from getting up. Luckily, due to Nick keeping a closer eye on Sarah, she is able to survive by being pulled to the side and not falling with the deck. Or alternatively, if you wanted to have a split path based on who saved Sarah between Nick and Clem, you could have Nick drop to save her with Jane. Though I don't see that happening and all three of them making it up. Nick would likely have to sacrifice himself in that version, which would yet again finish his story and character arc, so if you wanted to do that, you could. Nick and Sarah would also both die if Jane doesn't go down there. But you can see that the video isn't over yet, and obviously this is what if Nick survives, so killing him off in the same episode would just feel kind of pointless. So obviously we're not going to dive into those timelines, as they don't change too much. You would just have Sarah there. Luke would be mad at Jane if she didn't help, but it'd be paid back when she returns to save the group from Arvo. But with that mini timeline explored, let's go ahead and continue with Nick pulling Sarah away before she falls at all. In this variation of events, Sarah will be alive most of the time here. Jane dips from the group in the night, but likely with Nick showing up as she does. This is a neat follow-up to him staying awake to talk to Clem in episode 3. It makes sense why he'd be up while everyone else is resting. And he gets to say his farewell to Jane, just saying it's good that she's leaving before then walking away. Kenny and Luke argue about when to head out, with Nick taking Luke's side to support him. After they leave, they are approached by Arvo and his group, and Rebecca turns before Kenny and Clementine put her down. This sparks the gunfight between our two groups. If Sarah is alive, Nick would be very protective of her, taking a shoulder shot to cover for her. If not, Nick will be unharmed. He would also take out the walker of Arvo's sister if Clem fails to. By the end of the fight, Jane has returned, saving the group, but Nick is still giving her the cold shoulder. He would probably be on the side of Kenny not beating up Arvo, after he just lost his only family left. The group carries on, making it to the power plant, where Clementine would have to convince her peers to join the campfire. Kenny and Jane here are still the same, but Sarah and Nick are now also there. For Sarah, you just have to be there for her and also get Nick to rejoin. Speaking of, Nick requires Clementine to talk him out of hating Jane and giving her another chance. She can reference past mistakes Nick or other people have made in order to make it possible that Jane could redeem herself. She already saved their lives today. And so Jane and Nick make up. The next morning, Arvo leads them to the house he spoke of before, with the group crossing the ice lake. However, it goes awry, since Arvo rushes to escape and the ice under Luke cracks. With his injury, he's unable to escape on his own. Both Bonnie and Nick try to help him, with Bonnie advocating for Clem to go toward Luke, since she's light. However, Nick is not okay with putting Clem in harm's way like that. Ultimately, it's her own choice though, so she can either choose to save Luke or fight off the walkers. Now, Nick could try to pull Bonnie or Clementine away, as the smart thing would be to let Luke try and get himself out. But we've still got to leave some Nick is a screw-up material in, and realistically, Nick trying to chase and grab Bonnie or Clem would only risk breaking more of the ice. Once Luke goes under with Bonnie or Clem, Nick would break the ice to try and save them. This would mean Bonnie is guaranteed to survive no matter what, even if Clementine refused to break the ice and tried to get Nick to stop. But sadly, Luke is still lost, as I don't see a reason why he'd survive in this scenario. Nick and possibly Clem and Bonnie are taken inside to the fireplace before Kenny starts wailing on Arvo. Jane is able to break it up, and Clementine sleeps it off. When she awakes, Kenny is working on the truck, and Jane tries to talk to Clem about Kenny's mental state. Nick is out smoking with Bonnie, with both of them discussing their losses like Pete, Leland, and most recently Luke. When they notice Clementine is nearby, they seemingly end the conversation abruptly. Then, either Nick or Bonnie walk away to relieve themselves, depending on whether Clem went after Luke. If she did, then Nick would go, and if not, Bonnie would. Bonnie would have her normal dialogue with Clem until Nick returns and she heads off to let them talk. As for Nick's dialogue with Clem, she can ask what they were talking about before she showed up, ask how he's doing, or apologize for what happened. Nick replies to all of these by just referencing who they've lost so far: Pete, Alvin, Carlos, Rebecca, and now Luke. Nick worries about the future of their group, with Kenny now at his worst, Arvo being there and having AG to take care of, not to mention Sarah relying on Nick to keep her sane if she's still alive. If not, he would have also mentioned her death in the lineup too. Nick is kinda just confused about his place in life and promises not to blame Clementine for any of the stuff that's happened. He even plans to talk to Bonnie about it if she hates her right now. But the state the group is currently in isn't really looking good. Kenny eventually shows up eyeing up Nick for keeping Clem so long, and Nick says that she should go. He's gonna go talk with Bonnie. Kenny and Clem then work on the truck for a bit before Clem goes back inside to talk with Jane. She can also speak to Sarah in order to comfort her about Luke's death, but it only goes so far. Kenny eventually gets the truck working and the whole group briefly discusses where they're gonna go. Kenny is the only one wanting to go to Wellington aside from Clem, which is the player's choice. Nick never really seemed like he was into the idea when it was brought up back in episode 2, however it does seem more plausible now that they've got a baby to take care of. Some place for the kids to be safe is exactly what they need. Going back to House just isn't a good fit mentally, especially not if Sarah's still around. That place is filled with bad memories. Kenny of course uses Nick's genuine reasoning to attack the others for not instantly believing in his plan, even though Nick had to think it through for a bit. Everyone leaves and Clem talks to Kenny about the plan before they head inside to sleep. Clementine later wakes up to some sounds outside before going to investigate. Once she makes it outside, she finds Mike and Arvo attempting to steal the group's supplies and the truck. Bonnie then shows up shortly after with the remaining supplies in a bag before noticing Clementine. This encounter goes the same as it does canonically, and Bonnie breaks down after Clementine is shot. That's when Nick shows up looking at Bonnie and demanding to know what happened. This is where it finally gets revealed that Nick was thinking about leaving the group with Bonnie and Mike. But Bonnie wasn't sure Nick was up to it, so they tried to leave early. However, upon seeing Nick again, Bonnie makes the split decision to not run away and stay at Nick and Clementine's side. She has somewhat more of a connection here with the group now, and I think that makes it slightly harder to run from what just happened to Clementine on her watch. Kenny and Jane run outside shortly after, and the group quickly debates over Bonnie's involvement and if she should be allowed to stay. Nick is obviously her biggest advocate upon hearing that Arvo shot Clem unannounced, and Bonnie didn't run away from responsibility. Jane can also understand her wanting to get away because, she just did that recently, but respects the fact that she didn't leave Clementine to die. They get into the truck, and Kenny starts driving north. Sarah is also there too if she survived, though it's a bit cramped. Once Clem wakes up, Kenny starts up another argument about what happened, and Nick reveals that he knew of the plan to leave, but Bonnie and Mike did it in a bad way. Plus, he was cut out of it. Kenny gives Nick trouble over that, where Bonnie stays silent and Jane defends Nick for wanting to leave. As Clementine, you can join in with Kenny, shocked that Nick would betray you, defend him, also bringing up that he's looking out for Sarah if she's still alive, or try and stop the argument from a neutral stance. Admittedly, Jane and Kenny's conflict is a little less personal, since Bonnie and Nick are the bigger issue at hand, and they're also cutting each other off. So Jane can't do the full rant about Sarita. Kenny does still get stopped due to the cars going out to look for fuel alone. Now at this point, every person in the truck with the exception of Clementine and Sarah are against Kenny in some way, and they want to get away from him. And both of the exceptions are both determinate, with Sarah possibly being dead and Clementine also possibly wanting to leave Kenny. So I think just like in the game, Jane would try and convince the group to abandon Kenny while they have the chance. Now Bonnie, obviously fearing what Kenny will do if she doesn't leave the group and worried about her security in the group, is a bit okay with this, but Nick is a bit worried. Abandoning Kenny in a snowstorm is a lot different than leaving when they have shelter, especially now that Clementine is hurt. Plus, if Sarah is there, Nick has to think about the example he's setting for her. Jane wants to respond, but Walker starts showing up after some gunfire, which leads to Nick driving away. This does go better than Clementine driving, but it is still Nick and the blizzard is bad. Not to mention the walkers roaming, so I'd imagine the truck would still get stopped at some point. Jane runs off with AJ, and Nick yells for everyone to go after he's attacked through the window by a walker. Bonnie leaves the truck, with her pulling Sarah along too if she's there. Clementine can choose to leave or shoot the walker. If she shoots it, then she stays with Nick, traveling together. If she leaves, then she gets split up from Bonnie after more walkers show up. Either way, Clementine goes to the rest stop Kenny told them to meet at, and Nick and Kenny are there too. If you were with Nick, Kenny asks where AJ is before Nick tells him he's with Jane, and Kenny runs off. If you showed up alone, Kenny will bust open the door, staggering Clem, and Nick will be inside. Jane later arrives empty-handed, and both Kenny and Nick are terrified of what that means. Kenny runs outside and Nick follows him. Jane tells Clem to stay out of the upcoming events before Kenny returns angrily. Nick is shouting his name from behind him as Kenny swings at Jane. Nick shows up as the fight ensues, attempting to hold Kenny back only to be knocked aside. This puts Nick into fight mode, and both he and Jane team up to fight Ken. Now they are technically in self-defense, but Clementine sees a 2v1, making it easier to understand why she would try and help Kenny. She doesn't want anyone to die. This is pretty sick though, as Nick is finally standing up to Kenny, giving us a pretty cool bait and switch. We thought there was going to be a confrontation between Luke and Kenny, but now Luke is dead and Nick has had more focus. Plus, Nick and Jane never really liked each other, but now they're kind of forced together against Kenny. I honestly feel like this is a kind of cooler and more thought out switch up than Luke and Jane was in canon, because Nick has been around since episode 1. And he did get a decent amount of focus in the first few episodes before he had the first death. Now because Jane is more agile and trying to avoid physical attacks, while Nick is there specifically to defend Jane, Nick is going to be taking most of the beating here. This leads to him being knocked down after a bit, as he really doesn't have any notable feats, so I can't say he'd be a match for Kenny at all. Now this is where Sarah makes a pretty big change, surprisingly. If she was alive, then nothing really changes. Kenny tries to stab Jane, and Clementine has the choice to end the fight by choosing Kenny or not. After this takes place, Clem approaches Kenny, either saying goodbye to him or listening to him talk about what just happened. Nick would also chime in about how unhinged Kenny was, but after this, the group hears AJ crying and finds him in a nearby car. This is where it's revealed Jane orchestrated the situation to reveal Kenny's true colors. Nick realizes that Jane is kind of nuts in both scenarios, but Bonnie arrives as the group discusses. Nick questions where Sarah is, but Bonnie says that she lost her to the walkers. She tried to save her, but she just wasn't able to. The group is saddened by this news, especially after what fight just happened, but they're forced to continue onward after informing Bonnie of what just occurred. Obviously, tensions would be high between the three, whether it was Jane or Kenny who lived in the end, but I think this would force the group to use what they've got left. It's not like any one of them can just run off since they have AJ to take care of and Clementine as well. If Jane is still there, the group would likely head back to House in order to not risk losing anyone in the winter like with Sarah. Nick and Bonnie both advocate to let the family inside, as they refuse to give up on humanity. More on the Kenny ending later. But if Sarah was dead, Kenny still tries to stab Jane, but then a baby's cry is heard in the distance. Kenny staggers a bit and Jane is terrified. Bonnie approaches with AJ in her arms, causing Kenny to rush over to her. Slowly, the realization of what this means sets in on everyone, as Bonnie says that she found him in a nearby car. But when the others attempt to confront Jane, they find that she's already gone. Kenny opts to chase after her, but Bonnie tells him that it's over. They need to think about the baby. Nick and Kenny obviously have some bad blood between them now, but the extremity of what Jane pulled is enough for Nick to let it go once Kenny apologizes. Now in the Kenny ending for both versions, the group is able to find Wellington, but obviously they can't get in. Clem and AJ can, but then the story just ends up in the same as in canon. So we will follow the path of her choosing not to stay. But you'll have to wait until part 2 when we cover A New Frontier to see really what the changes Nick and Bonnie make. Surprisingly, Nick changed a pretty big amount, and even though it really isn't super visible yet, you can kind of tell where the thought is. Making Nick's stuff at the beginning of the game matter more, and also doing that bait and switch at the end where he kind of takes Luke and Jane's place is really cool. Seeing him forge a bond with Jane, even though they're completely diametrically opposed and Jane is kind of leeching everybody that he loves, is kind of also really cool. I just really liked writing that. I also think the idea of Bonnie and Nick actually bonding is also nice, because Luke was kind of the middleman in between them, and also they do have some shared history due to their time at House before. But yeah guys, that's all I've got for Season 2. Expect Season 3 and 4 to be pretty cool. And speaking of pretty cool, of course I've got to shout out our members: Ellie to Plug 2, Davisville84, Willie, Aiden Kearns, Zombie Warlord, yeah, Tifue, and Chief Strato Constituent. But as always, tell me if you liked this part, comment your requests for future videos, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.